Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to another episode of the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast, where we delve into the stories that shape our world and enrich our lives. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and we are broadcasting from just outside Washington, D.C. Are you a coffee lover? Do you enjoy the kick of spicy food? Have you ever wondered why these everyday items have such a profound effect on us? Well, you're in for a treat today. We are honored to have Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman with us to unravel the mysteries behind the toxins that surround us, from the spices in our kitchen to the vices we indulge in. Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up, and the title of his presentation is Nature's Toxins, From Spices to Vices. Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman is an evolutionary biologist at the University of California at Berkeley and an expert in the origins and impacts of natural toxins. Imagine this. Beneath the surface of your morning coffee bean or that red pepper flake you sprinkle on your pizza lies a complex world of chemicals. These chemicals are not just flavors, they are potent substances that have evolved over millennia. They serve as plant defenses against predators, and yet we humans have found ways to use and sometimes abuse all of this for our benefit. Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman's groundbreaking research combines evolution, chemistry, and neuroscience to explain why and how these toxins exist. We'll learn from Dr. Noah Whiteman today about the coevolutionary arms race between plants and animals. Dr. Whiteman will reveal how this chemical warfare has not only shaped the diversity of life on Earth, but is also deeply intertwined with our own human experience and all of nature's unique toxins.
A toxic larder. Ethanol is unique among nature's toxins because it cannot be easily placed into one of the chemical classes that are usually used to categorize the poisons we are discussing. Conveniently, though, many organisms convert ethanol to mevalonate, a precursor to terpenoids in the terpenoid pathway. So ethanol actually fits right in with terpenoids. Despite my father's alcohol use disorder, and as a light drinker myself, I cannot help but agree with Shakespeare's aphorism that good company, good welcome, good wine can make good people. I certainly think I am more fun when I've had a glass of champagne, but only one. At the same time, although alcohol is the most widely used social lubricant, the consensus is now that overall, any alcohol consumption, even one drink a day, carries health risks, including higher risk of cancer, liver disease, heart disease, and death in accidents. However, for people over 40 who are at higher risk of cardiovascular disease in certain populations, around 1/2 of a drink per day is associated with protecting against heart attacks. Still, Health Canada now recommends no more than 2 drinks per week, given that the costs outweigh the slight cardiovascular benefits. AUD is the third leading cause of preventable death in the United States, the first being tobacco use, and the second, poor diet and lack of exercise. Binge drinking kills more than 40,000 people per year in the United States alone. Still, I plan on having 1 glass of champagne to celebrate New Year's Eve with Shane. I partake despite the fact that I know that AUD has found its way into every branch of my family tree. Ethanol, like all the natural toxins we've discussed, didn't evolve with us in mind. Brewer's yeast, which humans domesticated from wild fruit-associated strains, efficiently ferment sugars into ethanol. Hence the genus name Saccharomyces, or sugar fungus. Yeast's ability to make ethanol evolved long before humans were around, as a means for these fungi to survive oxygen deprivation deep in rotting fruit. In the absence of oxygen, yeast can burn energy from sugar if they first convert the sugar into ethanol. Brewer's yeast is resistant to the toxic effects of ethanol, while most other microbes are not. So one way of looking at this is that yeast can use the ethanol it makes as a defense against competitor microbes that colonize the fruit too. So for brewer's yeast, ethanol is a poisonous private reserve of energy, a toxic larder. But there's a limit to their resistance. When ethanol levels exceed 20%, even brewer's yeast cells will perish in their own home brew. The Drosophila melanogaster fruit flies I study lived through the toxic niche carved out by brewer's yeast. As the old joke goes, time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana. And not just any banana will do. The insects prefer ripe fruit that hosts ethanol-producing yeast. Unsurprisingly, fruit flies are resistant to low concentrations of ethanol, like brewer's yeast, but unlike most other insects. In certain concentrations, around 3% alcohol by volume, consuming ethanol even extends their lifespan. Higher concentrations shorten their lives. But the cost-to-benefit ratio flips if parasitoid wasps are lurking. Using a syringe-like structure emerging from its midsection, a female parasitoid wasp injects a single egg into the body of a fruit fly larva, along with a dose of venom and virus-like particles that suppress the fly's immune system. After hatching in the fly larva, the wasp larva consumes the host just as the fly larva is about to form a puparium, which is the fly version of a butterfly's chrysalis. The wasp uses this borrowed pupal case to metamorphose into an adult. Instead of an adult fly emerging from the puparium, an adult wasp emerges from the sarcophagus. Using its immune system, the fly larva can sometimes kill the wasp's egg before it hatches. If that doesn't work, the wasp egg can be pickled in the blood of the fly by the ethanol the fly larva has consumed, but only if ethanol concentrations are at roughly the same as wine, or around 10 to 15%. Talk about stress drinking.
That, of course, is our guest today, Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman, reading a brief passage from his new book, Most Delicious Poison, the story of nature's toxins, from spices to vices. We will be talking to Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman about his book, his upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, and much, much more. We got a packed show, so let's dive into this captivating world of natural toxins with Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman. Prepare to be amazed, educated, and perhaps even a little unsettled as we explore the substances that have shaped our world and continue to influence our lives. Please join me in welcoming to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast, Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman. Dr. Noah Whiteman, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, thank you. It is a pleasure to be talking to you. You, of course, are going to be presenting at Smithsonian Associates coming up. The title of your presentation, Nature's Toxins, from Spices to Vices, and the title of your new book, Most Delicious Poison, is the subject of our conversation today. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks for reading. Thanks for sharing the book. Congratulations on the book. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise, I'm very excited for the Smithsonian Associates presentation. I will have a reading that I will do there, and I'll have a slide deck as well to share that sketches out the thesis of the book and the arc of time involved from the origin of land plants and animals to now.
I think this is going to be fascinating. What inspired you to do this? Because this is great work. And I think, we're all learning more about natural substances, about medicines that come from plants, and so I wonder what drew you to this, because especially with a title like Most Delicious Poison, we might think of it a slightly different way.
That's right. So the title I have thanks to Shakespeare. So if you read the book, you'll see exactly where that comes from, which work of Shakespeare, and it perfectly embodies this two-sided nature, I think, of our interaction with chemicals that plants, mushrooms, bacteria, and even some other animals make that we use and abuse. And I guess what motivated me was the sudden collision of two parts of my life that I had kept apart. And one part was my research, which actually focuses on why plants and other organisms make chemicals that I call toxins. And it turns out that many of them do this as a defense. So they will make, say, a toxin like nicotine to prevent insects from attacking them. It's a very useful tool that has evolved. The plant's ability to make these, that's the thing that's evolved. And the plants that do are afforded protection from insects, at least for a while. But then, some animals overcome those toxins. Nature finds a way, and through evolution, some insects actually end up specializing on plants that make nicotine. So they overcome them and even use them against their own enemies. So they co-opt the toxins, which I talk about in that specific case in the book on a chapter that includes nicotine. Mm-hmm. And I would say that, so my research on this area was going forth for a decade and a half. And then in 2017, in late 2017, my father died under mysterious circumstances. And it turns out he died from a lifelong overconsumption of some of nature's toxins. And so suddenly I began to see my own research in a new light. And it was the collision of those two things that the book was sort of born from. And I wrote a proposal to the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and was unbelievably awarded a fellowship that motivated me to actually write the book. And so I took a sabbatical from the University of California, Berkeley, and did it. And so that was the sort of motivation. I think had he not died in the way he did, I probably would never have written the book, and I probably would not have been inspired to kind of put it together in the way that I did.
Well, thank you. And again, congratulations on the book. We're sorry to hear about your father's passing. And so I know a little bit here in my own research, and we'll talk about this, but this was due to alcohol use disorder, AUD. And it's a struggle. Certainly, this occurred in my own family. I wonder, though, it influenced you in your work on toxins and probably influences you further.
Yeah, what's interesting is that I never thought of my work really as sort of extending from or involving anything related to alcohol use disorder. Mm-hmm. And it was only when he died that I suddenly saw it as maybe even a subconscious way of sort of understanding how that came to be, how his alcohol use disorder came to be, and eventually how he died. And I would say my past research before I started studying, chemicals that plants make that they use as defenses, was in the Galapagos Islands for my dissertation. And I worked on birds and their parasites there, so host-parasite interactions. And it wasn't until I did my postdoc at Harvard that I started working on plants. And so it was sort of this serendipitous, gradual thing. But in the book, I call it this green gravity kept pulling me in and moving me towards studying plants and the animals and other organisms that attack them. And so in hindsight, it is a story that is interwoven with my own kind of personal life and upbringing, especially as it relates to my dad and his alcohol use disorder. And so, it took a while in my mind for these two things to be interwoven. It didn't start out that way. But once it did, it was like I couldn't break them apart, really. Mm-hmm. And so now I would say my research it's sort of the motivation for it is these two things are intertwined, I would say. So why humans use and abuse chemicals, and how many animals do the same, actually. They use them at least. And one of the examples I give that's, I think, straightforward for people to understand are things like the monarch butterfly, which is a beautiful insect. And of course, a sort of naive way of approaching why they're beautiful is that somehow a creator created them for us to enjoy. But the evidence doesn't support that, right? We can't disprove that. But what we can show very clearly is that the warning coloration evolved to warn birds, which are the main predators of monarchs, that they are toxic. So if birds consume monarch butterflies, they will vomit. They have an emetic effect. And if they don't vomit, eventually they'll succumb to the poison. So there are heart poisons that are extremely potent that are found in the monarch. But the most interesting thing, I think, is that the monarch butterfly itself doesn't make the heart poisons. they obtain them from a different life stage when they were caterpillars and they were feeding on milkweed plants. And it's the milkweed plants that make the heart poisons, and the caterpillars eat them, the leaves. And when they do that, they're able to sequester those toxins and hold them in their bodies through metamorphosis. So the butterflies that emerge are loaded with these heart poisons that allow them to fly, from the prairies of Ontario all the way down to the mountaintops of Michoacan, Mexico, where they overwinter, and they fly down there relatively protected from predators. So these butterflies, in a way, are doing something similar to what we're doing. They're using chemicals, right, to sort of escape their demons, and of course, we're choosing to do that. Right, when we begin to experiment with these chemicals, but then in many cases, right, it's a gravity that we can't escape in the case of things like ethanol. But the other corollary is that the same kinds of heart poisons are made by things like foxglove plants, which are used and were used, those chemicals, to treat heart conditions like congestive heart failure. And now they're used to treat arrhythmias. And those toxins people have probably heard of. They're called digitoxin and digoxin. And foxgloves are in the digitalis genus. And so a concoction made from them was called digitalin. And that turned out to be probably the first clinical trial in the European medical literature by William Withering, was on foxglove to treat what was called dropsy, which is congestive heart failure, buildup of fluid in the lungs from congestive heart failure. So these things, if you think about it, is it that different what a monarch is doing, right? Co-opting these toxins that are made by plants, they're doing it innately. We are doing it sort of by choice and through culture, right? That information flows along with our genes, but through culture in parallel. So these are the themes in the book: the two-sided nature of it all, the co-option of it, and how animals and humans have both used these things for our own devices.
It's so fascinating. I just am smiling. My wife and I planted, I'll just personalize this slightly here. My wife and I planted a pollinator garden, and we ended up with a lot of bees, which was absolutely the goal. But we actually ended up with a couple of monarch, I guess, chrysalis that actually did result in monarch butterflies being born. Just a couple of them, not a great many of them, but it was one of the biggest joys we've experienced as we watched these things kind of come to life. And we planted milkweed, and so we're out there trying to, I suppose, do our part, as many are, as certainly as you are. And I want to talk about plants for just a second, in particular, the toxin capsaicin in chili peppers, because that actually that's a toxin that helps plants. And I wonder if you describe that and its role and what it means for nature as a whole to have that present.
Sure. So capsaicin is this compound that we love or love to hate, depending on the person. And it activates a particular receptor in our bodies that is called TRPV1. So that's expressed in our mouths, in nerves in our mouths, also elsewhere in our body it's expressed. And it activates this sensation as if it's heat that we're sort of detecting. And that's interesting because those particular nerves that express the TRPV1 receptor, that receptor is capable of detecting capsaicin, so sort of noxious chemical heat, and then thermal heat separately. So that's very neat, I think, in a way. There are these dual purpose channels, receptors in our nerves.
Does it retain the heat, or it generates?
No, it generates the sensation of heat.
It generates okay, wow.
Yeah, so so that's why we start sweating, right? And that sort of thing. So those same nerves are going to be triggered by thermal heat. The same receptor can be triggered by thermal heat and sort of this chemical that triggers a heat-like feeling. And so that's why your skin might get hot, you might get flushed, and it may explain why we like it, because with pain comes pleasure, right? Comes relief. It becomes relief from pain. Yeah. And that relief from pain can be a sought after experience, right? So that's interesting. So, but if you are, say, a mouse and you are chewing on a chili pepper, you're going to stop chewing probably. And that is because mice also have the same receptor we have, because we are relatively closely related to mice, right? Our common ancestor had this TRPV1 channel. And capsaicin is a compound that the plants do not need to live and reproduce. In other words, if we planted chili peppers and knocked out the genes to make capsaicin and planted them inside, they would do just fine. In fact, they might even have more seeds than ones that don't have them. But that changes when we introduce natural enemies like the mice, like caterpillars, like bacteria that infect the plants, like fungi that infect the plants into the equation. And plants that have things like capsaicin do better in the presence of enemies because they get eaten less. And that should make complete sense, right? If you think about your own response to capsaicin. Most children do not like capsaicin, right? This is a learned preference. If we, this idea that we like it, it doesn't happen sort of on its own. And there's an interesting thing going on here with peppers in particular. And that is that, well, first of all, almost all peppers, right, are native to North, Central, and South America. So they're really sort of a Western Hemisphere kind of phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And the capsaicin works as an antifungal. That's one thing. So we know from studies that people have done in the field that capsaicin protects the chili peppers from fungal attack. So that's one thing it does, but it probably protects them from a lot of different things, including herbivory, things that would eat the seeds, things that would eat the fruit, from insects to bacteria. But the peppers are brightly colored, aren't they? Mm-hmm. So unlike the monarch, bright colors in nature can mean several things. One thing they can mean is that they're signaling to a particular animal, right, that can see the color red. Most chilies are red or yellow, right, or orange. And okay, we can see those colors. Lots of other animals can too. And what is in the fruits of those peppers? Seeds. And what does the pepper plant want from the perspective of natural selection? To disperse itself, right? What would be the best way to do that? Well, a great way is to get an animal to move you, your seeds. And so what the chili peppers have done is evolve the ability to signal to birds primarily to disperse their seeds. So birds love eating chilies. They ingest the fruits and they poop the seeds out. But the bird might have flown 10 miles by the time it poops the seeds out. So from the perspective of dispersing the seeds, that's a great thing. The amazing thing is birds do not perceive capsaicin as spicy. They have lost the ability to perceive capsaicin as spicy. So their TRPV1 channel doesn't work in the same way as all the other things I was talking about, all the other animals, including us. So it looks like chilies and birds are sort of, chilies are signaling to birds and sort of via this private channel of communication. So like, eat me, I'm sweet. And we know peppers are sweet. We can taste that, right? But we taste the capsaicin. They don't. Mm-hmm. So they just get the goodness. They're not, it's not aversive to them. So you can think of the fruit dispersal part as, one reason why the chilies, these peppers grow so large. They're very well adapted to bird dispersal. But at the same time, it really benefits the pepper because all the other organisms are going to find the capsaicin aversive pretty much. And so it's this very amazing kind of dance that the pepper plants are doing, right? It's like between being eaten and wanting to be eaten. So, right, the fruits, they want the fruits to be eaten. They don't want the leaves or the roots to be eaten, right? Because they need those to make the fruits. So where and how these chemicals are placed in the plant really is a way for us to think about what natural selection has done to the plant, right? So they're going to invest heavily in these toxins in tissues that are really important to be protected from attack. But then sometimes some animals, for example, the birds, right, are sort of unaware of what's going on. And that's great for the pepper. So they're able to disperse the seeds for the pepper plant without the negative consequences of the capsaicin. So there's a little example of how both complicated it can be, but really also how simple it is if you think about it, right? So the capsaicin is not there for us. It's there to benefit the plant. But then, there's always a cost to these things in the nectar or the fruits because they need pollinators and fruit dispersers, right? So they have to be very careful about where they put these things and who can perceive them.
Yeah, I love this. This wonderful dance, as you describe, the fruit dispersal, the natural selection, how it's protecting. And it also does that. Well, there are also elements in nature. Saffron is one that that you discuss in the book
Right.
that has a natural toxin, perhaps, but
Yep.
also is medicinal.
Hmm.
And is it possible? Because I did read that there's a effect that's Prozac-like. Could it replace some of these medicines, some of these highly distilled medicines that are created?
Yeah, so a corollary would be St. John's wort. I don't know if you've heard of
Okay,
St.
sure,
John's wort.
sure.
Yeah,
Yep,
and that
yep.
is also used and has been now subjected to double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials, which are the gold standard and really the only way we can say it works like Prozac, right? So that's what I would first say.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things have to be subjected to trials like that in order to sort of test their safety and efficacy. And what's interesting is that, yes, as you mentioned, the field, the crocus, right, saffron, produces saffron, and which are from the flowers of the plant. The actual flowers are harvested, and that's why those little threads, those little kind of orange-red threads in your saffron container are so precious because they're collected by, fingers of somebody is pulling those out of the plant. And there are, I would say, sort of natural defense chemicals called crocins that these crocuses make. And one of them breaks down into safranal when we chew the saffron, or when, say, a caterpillar or a mouse chews the saffron. And those chemicals are biologically active. And there have been a number of small studies, including double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials, but small in number in terms of the number of people involved and the number of studies, done in Iran, and where it's used as widely as a folk remedy there for lots of different maladies. And there is evidence that safranal, and among other chemicals in saffron, has Prozac-like effects, sort of has anti-depression, OCD effects. Now, will it eventually replace Prozac? Well, I think the proof is in the pudding, right? More time, more studies are required to sort of address that, as they've been done in St. John's wort. So I would say that the jury's still out, but it's important to remember that there's no reason why it couldn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
if it is as safe and effective, or maybe more so. So, but the sort of two-sidedness to all this, there's no reason that it should work. There's no reason that it shouldn't. We have to try it and test it out. But it does go back to this other idea that folk remedies that stem from indigenous knowledge holders often is the starting point for most of the natural products that we use, and ones that are even refined that we wouldn't think of that way, right? So I would say that that's the other theme in the book, that indigenous and local knowledge holders are often the ones that have already done some of the sort of testing, right, for these, especially plants. And then later, those plants are then, the compounds from those plants are isolated, and then these sort of quote unquote modern drugs arise from them. But this is just really important to point out that the indigenous knowledge holders and local knowledge holders are often the source of many of our most coveted drugs.
Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a nonprofit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody. Dr. Noah Whiteman is our guest today. Dr. Whiteman will be appearing and presenting at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes today for more information about Dr. Whiteman, his new book titled Most Delicious Poison, and his upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. Will have links to Dr. Whiteman's work at noahwhiteman.org, as well as other links and information. The book is getting great reviews, Dr. Whiteman. I've seen several really praiseworthy notes. One I thought really struck me. It's from Daniel Lieberman, who's the author of The Story of the Human Body. Daniel Lieberman says, I wish I could travel the world with Noah Whiteman and enjoy firsthand his deep and eclectic knowledge of the thousands of compounds that plants evolved to defend themselves against predators. I thought that was really just a great comment on the book and your work. And I want to talk about one other related subject, kind of going beyond the conversation we had about saffron replacing medicines. Are there other concerns? Are there ethical concerns, perhaps, about using natural toxins? Maybe addictive ones that, like morphine, that occur in this conversation that we should be aware of.
Yes, I think all of these things, when they enter sort of our human world, right? Mm-hmm. We can think about psychedelics, for example, which mm-hmm. are having a moment, right? Mm-hmm. And seen not only as panaceas for treating especially certain drug use disorders, but also recreationally, right? Many more people seem to be using them. And so there are many ethical questions about this. And one is, first of all, where are the drugs coming from, right? And as we know, that is a major geopolitical kind of issue, isn't it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one question. The other is from whom, which knowledge holders gave rise to this information, and what, are they benefiting from this discussion? The other is, of course, safety, right? Is it safe to take these chemicals? And is it effective, if it's a medical use? And those things have to be assessed in a very professional clinical setting, in a context that ethicists are involved, but also medical doctors, mm-hmm. Pharmacologists, et cetera, right? Because and so these things that are out there, this idea that this appeal to nature fallacy, which I talk about a lot in the book, mm-hmm. which is that, natural things are good just because they're natural, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the appeal to nature fallacy. We know that's not true. So, for example, morphine is a good example of that. It's like, yes, it's a great drug for relieving pain. Maybe one of the best still, right? Opioids and, opiates and synthetic opioids are among the most effective pain relieving drugs for major, acute pain and even chronic pain. The problem is that a subset of the population is very susceptible to opioid use disorder, as we now know. And so what sounds fine initially, like fentanyl, for example, right? There were many reasons why it was developed and was used sort of instead of morphine. There were lots of pharmacological reasons for this. Well, it turns out, though, that some of those same reasons might be why it's so problematic, right, in terms of its addictive potential.
Well, congrats on all your work. And I'll just have to say, selfishly, we'd love to have you back. Congrats on this book. Again, the title is Most Delicious Poison, The Story of Nature's Toxins, From Spices to Vices. Dr. Noah Whiteman's been our guest. We'll have links so that our audience can find out more about Dr. Whiteman and his upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. But again, thank you for your time today. Thanks for being generous with the reading. Congrats on the book, and my best to you. We'll look forward to seeing you at Smithsonian Associates coming up.
Thanks so much, Paul. These were great questions, and it was a pleasure to be with you and your audience, and I really look forward to this Smithsonian Associates event.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on Community Radio.
My thanks to author and biologist, Smithsonian Associate Noah Whiteman, who will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. And the title of his presentation is Nature's Toxins, From Spices to Vices. Please check out our website for more details about Noah Whiteman's upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. My thanks to the Smithsonian for all they do to support the show. My thanks to you, my wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Please be well and be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody, and we will see you next week.